Hello everyone, bringing you a video today which I think will be the first in a prolonged series looking at the 1937 pattern web equipment for its very long period of use. Of course still in use with some TA units into the 1970s and even the 1980s in some instances. Some very interesting photographs of Army Catering Corps wearing DPM with unblancoed 1937 pattern webbing, which is quite the contrast. We're going right to the introduction of 1937 pattern essentially with this video, looking at it as it was introduced. Talk a little bit about the design ethos behind it and looking at the components on the mannequin in part one. So, what we have set up on the mannequin here is a basic set of battle order 1937 pattern. And battle order was the primary way that 1937 pattern was intended to be worn, with a haversack on the back, an enlarged haversack compared to the 1908 pattern. And we'll get into talking about the details of the components and how they're worn here through the video. A little bit of background to 1937 pattern. The fitting instructions describe it as a design based on 1908, and that's a little bit of a stretch, to be fair. I would say it owes more to Mill's developments during the 1920s and 30s. For example, the 1919 naval pattern equipment, which used the thinner waist belt right as opposed to the 1908 belt, and used the same type of braces, that sort of thing, a very similar water bottle carrier. That's not actually on the mannequin at present, and we'll get to that in a minute or two. So in terms of the design of the equipment, it really is drawing on Mill's developmental work on various private purchase items, officers' web equipment, 1919 pattern for the Royal Navy, 1925 pattern for the Royal Air Force, and commercial web equipment made throughout the period between the First and the Second World War. The main reason behind the need for a new equipment set, quite apart from updating something to a bit more modern, which has a haversack that's better for carrying a subsistence load in the field. The 1908 haversack was a bit small for that and certainly was heavily packed out when it was used in battle order during the First World War. The equipment also needed to accommodate the magazines for the Bren light machine gun, which of course have been introduced as a section issue of the British Army for infantry battalions, and the pouches are needed to carry the box magazines for the Bren. Of course, the cartridge carriers of the 1908 are not suitable for this purpose. That goes without saying. So you have a move away from cartridge carriers, which is to say individual pockets which hold charges of ammunition for the rifle, to pouches which can accommodate the magazines for the Bren light machine gun. And of course, these will also accommodate grenades and rifle ammunition and bandoliers. And that is the intention behind these. Of course, every man will be carrying ammunition for the Bren, so these are used for that purpose. In the infantry battalions, you have the ability to carry magazines for the Bren. So that's the design thinking behind the pouches. Another thing that the equipment was supposed to do was to get rid of excess items hanging below the belt. You still have the bayonet, of course, but as we look at this, as we move it around, the water bottle is not actually being carried in its carrier below the belt. It's in the haversack. And this was an initial part of the design. The water bottle would be carried in the enlarged haversack to stop it flopping around on the hip and basically being a big lump. When a water bottle's full, it's quite heavy. Flapping around on the hip, it was not seen as a desirable thing to have. So that's been moved into the haversack. And certainly in 1939-40 in France, you do see quite a few photographs of men who don't have the bottle on the brace ends. It's being carried in the haversack or is omitted in some instances. The haversack can be seen to be empty as well in some training scenarios. So that's a little bit of background to the equipment. As we have it set up here, of course, it's all first issue components. When we look at these in more detail, you'll find the dates on these vary massively. Some of them are quite early dated components, some of them are actually dated to the 1950s, because when later production after the war was reintroduced, with the exception of the basic pouches, a lot of the components went back to their initial methods of manufacture. So we have reduction woven L straps supporting the haversack there. We have the Mach 1 basic pouches at the front here, and you can see this illustrates the point nicely, which has been discussed in previous videos. They hang very low below the belt. The C-hooks on the rear are set very high. So from that point of view, they offer a bit of encumbrance, because when you're sitting down wearing these, they tend to dig into the hips, dig into the top of the thighs rather, and that would be modified, as we'll get into in later videos. And of course we have the standard belt here from the 1937 pattern equipment, which adjusts by doubling back on itself. And of course this system uses C-hooks and pockets on the back to adjust, with little keepers here to keep the doubled over section together. And we have the 1919 patent buckle, which of course had appeared with the 1919 pattern web equipment and the officers' web equipment used subsequently from that point. and then it was used on various other equipment sets in the interwar period. So that's what we can see at the front of the equipment here. One major change from 1908 pattern, of course, is the haversack, and when it was worn, the pack, not patterned as part of 1937 pattern, still part of the 1908 equipment at this time. When they were worn on the back, we used L-straps with hooks, which hook into the top of the pouch here, into the buckle, which means that the haversack or the pack can be easily removed from the equipment. So it links into the equipment, it all holds itself together, it supports the pouches, it's no longer buckled directly onto the braces of the equipment, it's supported using L-straps on the front there, as you can see. We'll move this round now and we'll have a look at the left-hand side. Looking at the left-hand side of the mannequin here, one thing I will mention very briefly, you can probably see here the haversack and how high this sits on the back. It's a little difficult with the mannequin to actually get it to sit high enough, but it should sit high on the back, certainly in the early war period. The army, almost going back to, I suppose, Victorian ideals of how the soldiers should look, certainly the haversack was seen worn high on the shoulders, which in the grand scheme of things, it's not the best way to carry a load, but that's how it was done. We lift the arm of the service dress jacket out of the way, we can see the belt coming round here in the belt hook on the service dress jacket. Just behind that we have the bayonet in its frog. Now period photographs do show the bayonet in front of the belt hook or behind it. The fitting instructions show chaps wearing battle dress, so obviously when wearing the equipment here I'm not entirely sure what the prescribed method was as whether you have the bayonet behind or in front of the belt hook. You do see both, just to note that here. And you have the bayonet frog, a very simple design based on previous mills frogs. Obviously British bayonet scabbards have a stud, so you have two webbing loops there which the stud fits between, and then you do also, in addition to the design, not something that was found on the 1908 pattern bayonet frog, you have a stabilising strap at the top here which loops around the handle of the bayonet and just stops it from swinging around too much. This is the one item which inevitably hangs below the belt, although sometimes bayonets of course would be carried up on the equipment. There were various ways of doing this. Certainly the Home Guard did this, and there are photographs of other units doing it as well, but as designed the frog hangs down below the belt there, and that's the one bit of equipment which the design took us inevitably hanging below the belt. We'll move this round now and we'll have a look at the back. Looking at the back of the mannequin here, we can see the haversack carried on the back, and as said previously, this is the way 1937 pattern was intended to be worn, in battle order most of the time, with the haversack on the back. And in large design, it holds the mess tins, which with the 1908 pattern and the preceding D-shaped mess tins were often seen hung below the haversack, or in some instances even attached to the belt. And in this instance, of course, they are a new design of oblong mess tins which fit neatly in the compartments within the haversack, which is something we'll have a look at in part 2, of course. So a new design from that point of view, designed to contain various items which previously had to be carried externally. You can also, of course, roll and fold the ground sheet underneath the flap to give some weatherproofing, and it's all carried as one little package on the back there, which can be removed easily because the L-straps can just be unhooked and it can be taken off like a rucksack. Down below, just underneath the haversack here, we can see the brace ends coming down, buckling onto the back of the belt. The braces, of course, are a modified design. They have a 2-inch section over the shoulder and then neck down to this 1-inch strap here. We'll just remove the haversack and we can look at the braces in a little bit more detail. So with the haversack removed, you can see the braces come down over the shoulders. They are reduced down from 2 inches to 1 inch using a reduction weaving method the Mills company used. This would be modified, and in some instances some manufacturers couldn't do this as webbing was needed in much greater quantities. Various different methods of doing this would be introduced, and we'll have a look at that in future videos. They come down, cross in the back, and there is in fact a loop, as you can see there, which is something we'll look at in more detail in part 2, where they cross over. So they are in fact looped together. They are captive at the back here. One is looped through the loop on the other, and they just buckle onto the back of the belt there to support the equipment. Looking at the right hand side of the mannequin here, there's actually not a great deal to see. We do not have the water bottle on the brace ends here. As said, it's carried in the haversack. So that's the intended place it will be carried, it's in the haversack, and you therefore don't have anything hanging down below the belt here. The only thing that hangs below the belt is the bayonet, and that was sort of trumpeted as one great advantage of this design. So nothing on the right hip there. So that's the web equipment in battle order. As said previously, this is how it was meant to be worn most of the time. This was the way it was supposed to be worn in the field the majority of the time. The pack, of course, would be carrying unit transport is the intention behind that. So only on changing stations and so forth would it be necessary to carry the pack. By way of completeness, we'll have a look at that now. We'll have a look at the equipment with the pack attached and the bottle in its carrier down on the hip. So now we have the equipment set up in marching order. There's not a huge amount of difference to see from the front, but on the left hip, if I move the arm of the service dress jacket out of the way, you can see the haversack is carried down on the brace ends. The bayonet is tucked away behind that. So this has been moved round onto the hip. On the back here we have the 1908 pattern pack, and as you can see it's complete here with the supporting straps. As said previously, still patterned as part of the 1908 equipment, not part of the 1937 pattern, but intended to be worn with it for changing station, that sort of thing, when it was necessary to wear marching order and carry more than you could in the battle order equipment. So not patterned as part of the equipment, but intended to be used with it. It wasn't until after the Second World War that this would be repatterned as part of 1937 pattern. Of course, during the course of the Second World War, it would prove necessary in some theatres, in some scenarios, to use the pack in the field to carry more than you could in the battle order with the haversack on the back. But that was specific situations. The Chindits are an example of that, and operations in the Far East where the haversack proved inadequate to carry the loads necessary. But as a rule, certainly when it was introduced, the web equipment was intended to primarily be worn in battle order, and this would only be used for changing stations, that sort of thing. And looking at the right hand side of the mannequin, if I lift the service dress jacket arm out of the way, we can see the water bottle carried in its own carrier on the hip here, obviously freeing up that space in the haversack to carry that little bit extra kit. When changing stations, you need to be maximising the carrying capacity of the web equipment, taking a lot of kit with you, of course, so this just adds to that. So it's in its own carrier here on the hip, this being one of the 1939 dated aluminium water bottles. This design, of course, was not in service very long. After the outbreak of the Second World War, aluminium very quickly became a scarce material. It was needed for various other applications, notably building aircraft. So aluminium water bottles disappeared from the scene, and you'd say this is an early war part of the kit to see is these aluminium water bottles. So one of those in the carrier there on the hip. So there we are, that's a look at initial issue 1937 pattern web equipment. I hope you found it interesting looking through this. As I say, this is part one in what will probably be quite a prolonged series looking at 1937 pattern, various periods through its life, its period of use, which, as I say, does span quite a time. If you'd like to see those videos going forward, then please do consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And whether you're newly subscribing or you've previously subscribed, please do make sure you hit the little bell, the little notification button down below. That will, of course, alert you when I upload future videos. If you really like my uploads and you'd like to support the channel, you can. There's both Patreon and PayPal linked down below. And as ever, a massive thank you to everybody who supports the channel using those methods. It really is very much appreciated. Thank you very much, everyone. If you'd like to follow the channel on social media, you can. There's Facebook, Instagram and Twitter all linked down below. But if you'd like to get in touch, we don't really use social media. There's also an email address down there as well. But that's everything for this video. So until next time, bye for now.